Imagine the unthinkable. The greatest battle ever fought was not won by the forces of light. In the golden halls of heaven itself, where no shadow had ever fallen, the morning star's blade found its mark. Michael the Archangel, God's own champion, lies defeated. And now, for the first time in eternity, darkness sits on heaven's throne. What happens to our world, our faith, our very souls, when the impossible becomes reality and evil wins the ultimate victory? Welcome to Forbidden Chronicles, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Our journey begins in the realm beyond time, where armies of light and darkness gathered for a war that would decide the fate of all creation. Chapter 1: The War Before Time. Before the first star was born, before Earth knew the touch of light, a war raged in the highest heaven. This was not a battle fought with earthly weapons, but with power that could shatter worlds and remake reality itself. Michael stood at the front of God's army, his armor blazing like captured starlight. His very presence made demons tremble and angels sing with joy. Behind him stretched endless ranks of warriors, seraphim with 6 wings burning like fire, cherubim whose faces held the wisdom of ages, and mighty angels whose swords could cut through the fabric of space itself. Across the crystal battlefield, Satan gathered his own forces. Once he had been Lucifer, the most beautiful angel ever created. His light had been so bright that even Michael had admired him. But pride had poisoned that beauty, turning it into something terrible and magnificent. "I will ascend to heaven," Satan had declared. "I will raise my throne above the stars of God." Those words had split heaven in two, turning brother against brother in a conflict that shook the very foundations of existence. The armies faced each other across a plain of living crystal that reflected their glory like a mirror made of diamonds. Lightning danced between the ranks as power met power. Angels who had sung together since the dawn of time now pointed weapons at each other's hearts. Michael raised his sword, not made of metal, but of pure divine justice itself. Its light was so brilliant that darkness fled from it like shadows at sunrise. This blade had never known defeat, had never failed to strike down evil wherever it was found. But Satan smiled, and in that smile was a terrible confidence that made the stars themselves grow dim with fear. Chapter 2: Michael's Divine Arsenal. Michael the Archangel was more than heaven's greatest warrior. He was the living embodiment of God's justice and power. His very name meant, "Who is like God?" And for good reason. No force of darkness had ever stood against him and survived. Throughout history, Michael had been God's enforcer on earth. When Daniel needed protection in the lion's den, Michael stood guard. When Moses led Israel from Egypt, Michael cleared their path. Every miracle, every divine rescue, every moment when good triumphed over impossible odds, Michael's hand was there, making it happen. His sword was forged from the first light that ever shone, tempered in the fire of God's holiness. This weapon could cut through any defense, destroy any evil, and bring justice to any situation. It had struck down armies of demons without ever growing dull or weak. His armor was made from righteousness itself, pure, unbreakable, and shining with the glory of heaven. No weapon forged in darkness could penetrate it. No lie could corrupt it. No temptation could stain it. Michael wore God's own character as his protection. His shield bore the name of the Almighty, written in letters of living fire. Behind this defense, he had protected the innocent, defended the weak, and turned back the forces of hell countless times. It had never failed, never cracked, never been overcome. The angels looked at their champion and felt their hearts fill with confidence. How could such power be defeated? How could one who fought with God's own strength ever fall? Michael had been their protector since time began, their hope in every dark hour. But across the battlefield, Satan's eyes gleamed with knowledge that would soon turn heaven's confidence to horror. Chapter 3. The moment everything changed. The battle began with a sound like thunder and starlight colliding. Michael and Satan met in the center of the crystal plane, their weapons creating shockwaves that rippled across eternity itself. For hours that felt like years, the two champions fought. Their swords rang against each other with sounds that made new stars burst into flame. Every clash sent waves of power rolling across heaven, making the very throne of God tremble with the force of their combat. Michael fought with perfect technique, his blade dancing in patterns that had never failed him. Each strike carried the weight of divine law, each block the strength of eternal justice. He pressed Satan back step by step, driving the fallen angel toward the edge of heaven itself. But then Satan did something that no one expected, something that changed everything forever. Instead of fighting Michael's strength with strength, he fought it with knowledge. In the split second when Michael raised his sword for the final winning blow, Satan whispered 3 words that froze the archangel's heart with terrible understanding. "She chose me." Michael's sword hesitated, just for one heartbeat, just for one impossible moment. But in that moment, Satan's blade found its mark, sliding between the plates of righteousness like a whisper of doubt through a perfect heart. Michael's eyes went wide with shock and pain. The light of his armor began to flicker like a candle in the wind. For the first time since creation began, God's champion was falling. "How?" Michael gasped, his voice echoing across heaven like a dying song. Satan smiled as he twisted the blade deeper. "Even God cannot force love, my brother. And she chose the darkness." With those words, Michael the archangel fell from the heights of heaven, his light fading as he tumbled toward the void below. The impossible had happened. The unthinkable had become reality. Satan stood alone on the crystal battlefield, his dark wings spread wide in victory, while all of heaven watched in stunned, terrified silence. Chapter 4. Heaven Under Siege. The moment Michael's light vanished, chaos erupted across heaven's golden streets. Angels who had never known fear suddenly felt it creeping through their hearts like ice in their veins. Gabriel, the messenger of God, rushed toward the battlefield, but stopped when he saw Satan standing where Michael should have been. "This cannot be," he whispered, but his words carried no power against the terrible reality before him. Satan's army surged forward like a tide of darkness sweeping over light itself. Demons that had been banished from heaven eons ago now returned as conquerors, their laughter echoing off the crystal walls like the sound of breaking glass. The tree of life, which had stood at the center of paradise since time began to wither as demonic hands touched its bark. Its golden fruit turned black, and its leaves fell like tears of light onto the corrupted ground below. The river of life, whose waters had brought healing and joy for eternity, ran red with something that might have been blood, or might have been something worse. Angels who tried to drink from it fell to their knees, screaming in languages that had never been heard in heaven before. Seraphim, who had spent eternity singing "Holy, Holy, Holy," found the words turning to ash in their mouths. Their 6 wings, which had been pure white like fresh snow, began to show patches of grey and black, spreading like infection. Through it all, God remained silent on his throne. The angels looked toward the throne room, hoping for some sign, some word, some miracle that would set everything right again. But the golden doors remained closed, and no voice came from within. Satan walked through heaven's streets like a king surveying his new kingdom. Wherever his feet touched the golden pavement, the metal turned dull and dark. Wherever his shadow fell, the light grew dim and cold. "Kneel," he commanded, and one by one, the angels of heaven fell to their knees before the Prince of Darkness. Some wept, some tried to resist, but all eventually bowed, because there was no Michael left to stand for them. Chapter 5. The New Dark Order. Satan's coronation took place in the very heart of heaven, where God's throne had once been the source of all light and life. Now it served as the foundation for something far more terrible. The fallen angel constructed his new throne from the shattered pieces of Michael's armor, mixed with the crystal tears of defeated angels. It rose high above heaven's streets, like a mountain of corrupted glory, dark and beautiful, and wrong in every way that mattered. One by one, he called the faithful angels before him. Each was given a choice: serve the new order, or join Michael in the void below. Most chose to serve. Their white robes turned black, their halos became crowns of thorns, and their songs of praise became hymns to darkness. The few who refused were not killed. Death was too merciful for Satan's purposes. Instead, they were transformed into living monuments to his victory. Gabriel became a statue of weeping gold. Raphael was turned into a fountain that ran with tears instead of water. Uriel became a lamp that gave off shadows instead of light. Satan established new laws to replace the commandments that had governed heaven since creation. "Hate your enemies," read the first. "Lie whenever truth brings pain," read the second. "Take what you desire, regardless of the cost to others," read the third. The worship services that had once filled heaven with joy became ceremonies of corruption. Angels were forced to sing praises to pride, selfishness, and cruelty. The words of their songs rewrote themselves, turning prayers into curses and hymns into spells of binding darkness. Heaven's libraries, which had contained all knowledge and wisdom, were burned and replaced with books of deception. Truth became illegal. Hope became forbidden. Love became the greatest crime of all. Satan sat on his throne of corrupted glory and looked out over his new kingdom with satisfaction. He had done what no one thought possible. He had conquered heaven itself, and this was only the beginning. Below, on the earth he had abandoned for so long, humanity was about to discover what it meant to live in a universe where evil had won the ultimate victory. Chapter 6. Earth's Darkest Hour. The first sign on earth was the silence. Around the world, every church bell stopped ringing at the exact same moment. Every prayer offered up received no answer but empty air. Every miracle that had been about to happen simply didn't. Children in hospitals who should have recovered didn't. Natural disasters that should have been prevented by divine intervention struck with unprecedented fury. The very air seemed heavier, as if hope itself had become more difficult to breathe. Within days, demons walked openly among humans. They no longer had to hide in shadows or work through subtle temptation. With Michael defeated and heaven conquered, they were free to reveal themselves in all their terrible glory. Politicians who had secretly served darkness for years threw off their masks. They announced new laws that made cruelty legal and kindness a crime. Schools began teaching children that selfishness was virtue and that helping others was weakness. Natural disasters multiplied beyond anything in recorded history. Earthquakes split the ground in perfect straight lines, as if the earth itself was being carved up like a prize. Hurricanes formed perfect spirals that spelled out blasphemous words when viewed from space. But the worst change was in the children. Babies born after Michael's fall came into the world different. Their eyes held knowledge no infant should possess. Their first words were often curses. Their laughter sounded like the breaking of precious things. Parents around the world wept as they watched their children they had prayed for, hoped for, loved before they were even born, grow up to serve masters of darkness with enthusiasm that broke their hearts. Underground communities began to form. Small groups of believers who refused to accept the new reality huddled together in basements and caves. They whispered prayers that seemed to go nowhere, read books that the government had banned, and told their children stories of a time when good was stronger than evil. These communities lived in constant fear of discovery. The punishment for maintaining faith in the defeated God was not death, but something much worse: forced service in Satan's new order, with your mind intact, but your will enslaved forever. Chapter 7: When Religions Crumble. The crisis hit every house of worship on earth simultaneously. Priests woke up to find their altars cracked down the middle. Rabbis discovered that their Torah scrolls had turned blank overnight. Imams found their mosques filled with a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Christians faced the hardest blow of all. Their entire faith was built on the promise that God's love was stronger than any darkness, that good would ultimately triumph over evil. How could they maintain belief when the evidence before their eyes proved otherwise? Some church leaders tried to deny what had happened. "It's a test," they told their shrinking congregations. "God is testing our faith." But their words rang hollow in buildings where the cross no longer seemed to offer comfort or hope. Others went in the opposite direction, embracing what they called theological realism. If Satan had won, then perhaps he had been right all along. Perhaps selfishness was the true nature of existence. Perhaps the strong were meant to rule over the weak. New religious movements sprang up like weeds after a fire. The Church of Accepting Reality taught that Satan's victory proved he had always been the true God. The Fellowship of Darkness claimed that evil was simply another form of divine will, and that serving Satan was the same as serving God. Islamic communities struggled with verses in the Quran that promised Allah's ultimate victory over all evil. How could an all-powerful, all-knowing God have been defeated? Some concluded that Allah must have allowed this to happen for reasons beyond human understanding. Others began to wonder if their understanding of God had been wrong from the beginning. Jewish communities faced their own crisis of faith. The Hebrew scriptures were filled with promises that God would never abandon his people, that his covenant was eternal and unbreakable. Yet here they were, apparently abandoned in a world ruled by the enemy of all that was holy. Buddhism and Hinduism adapted more easily, their concepts of cycles and cosmic balance allowing for temporary victories of darkness. But even these faiths struggled to explain how the realm of pure spirit could be conquered by material evil. Underground, a new kind of faith began to emerge. Believers from all traditions started meeting together, sharing their doubts, their hopes, and their determination to keep believing, even when belief seemed impossible. Chapter 8: The Science of Supernatural Evil. Dr. Sarah Chen stared at her computer screen in disbelief. The mathematical equation she had been working on for months, a formula describing the gravitational constant, had changed overnight. The numbers were different. Not wrong, just different. As if the fundamental laws of physics had been rewritten. Around the world, scientists were making similar discoveries. The speed of light had slowed down by exactly 3.33%. Pi, the mathematical constant that had remained unchanged since numbers were invented, now calculated to a different decimal expansion. Carbon dating showed that some rocks were aging backward. Laboratory experiments that had worked perfectly for decades suddenly produced impossible results. Chemicals that should have been stable exploded without cause. Computer programs designed to calculate simple math began outputting results in ancient languages that scholars couldn't translate. The Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland detected particles that shouldn't exist, matter that seemed to be made of pure malice, energy signatures that spelled out words in alphabets that predated human civilization. When scientists tried to study these particles more closely, the equipment would break down in ways that defied explanation. Medical researchers found that diseases were evolving at impossible speeds. Cancers that had been in remission suddenly returned with symptoms that read like biblical plagues. New viruses appeared that didn't just attack the body, they seemed to attack the soul, leaving patients physically healthy but emotionally dead inside. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports from astronomers. Stars were going out, not exploding or collapsing, just stopping. The light they had been producing for billions of years simply ceased, leaving expanding patches of darkness in the night sky. Some scientists tried to find rational explanations. They proposed that humanity was experiencing a collective hallucination, or that unknown technology was creating these effects. But deep down, most knew they were witnessing something beyond the reach of natural law. A few brave researchers began to study what they called supernatural physics, the science of how reality itself could be rewritten by spiritual forces. Their papers were rejected by every scientific journal, but they kept working, driven by the knowledge that understanding this new reality might be humanity's only hope. Universities became divided between those who embraced the new dark sciences and those who insisted that traditional physics still applied. The battle for truth was no longer fought in laboratories, but in the human heart's capacity to believe that some things were still sacred. Chapter 9: Art, Music, and the Corruption of Beauty. Maya Rodriguez had been a concert pianist her entire life. Her fingers knew Mozart like a native language, could make Chopin sing like a lover's whisper. But on the morning after Michael's fall, something changed. She sat down to practice her usual routine, Bach's Goldberg variations, pieces she had played thousands of times. But the notes that came from the piano were wrong. Not technically wrong. Her fingers hit the correct keys. But the sound itself had been transformed into something that made her skin crawl. Where Bach's mathematical beauty should have lifted her spirit, now the music seemed to mock everything pure and good. The harmonies that had once celebrated divine order now sounded like equations for spreading chaos. Every melody became a lament for innocence lost. Around the world, musicians were reporting the same phenomenon. Orchestras found that their instruments produced sounds that made audiences weep with despair instead of joy. Children's lullabies transformed into songs that gave listeners nightmares. Even simple folk songs began to carry undertones of cruelty and hopelessness. Visual artists faced their own crisis. Painters, who tried to create beautiful landscapes, found their brushes producing scenes of decay and horror instead. Sculptors working on monuments to love and peace discovered their hands shaping forms that celebrated violence and hatred. The great museums of the world became battlegrounds between those who wanted to destroy the corrupted art and those who believed it should be preserved as evidence of what had happened to human creativity. The Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile now looked like a sneer of contempt. Michelangelo's David appeared to be preparing for battle against heaven itself. Hollywood and the entertainment industry adapted quickly to the new reality. Movies that had been in production as family-friendly adventures were rewritten as tutorials in moral corruption. Television shows began featuring protagonists who won through betrayal and cruelty, teaching children that these were virtues to be admired. Video games became training grounds for spiritual warfare, not the kind that helped good defeat evil, but the kind that taught players how to embrace darkness as their ally. Social media algorithms were redesigned to promote content that spread despair, hatred, and division. Yet in hidden corners of the world, small groups of artists continued trying to create beauty. They painted in basements by candlelight, wrote songs that would never be performed publicly, and crafted sculptures from materials found in junkyards. Their art was often crude compared to the technical mastery of the corrupted mainstream, but it carried something precious, the stubborn human insistence that beauty could still exist. Chapter 10. Love in the Time of Darkness. Jennifer and David had been married for 15 years when the world changed. They had built their relationship on trust, kindness, and shared faith in a God who they believed blessed their union. Now they sat across from each other at their breakfast table, wondering if love itself could survive in a world where evil had won. The changes started small. David found himself feeling irritated by things Jennifer did that had never bothered him before. Jennifer noticed herself keeping small secrets, telling tiny lies about where she had been or what she was thinking. The warmth they had shared for years began to feel forced, artificial. Their children, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Jack, were changing too. Emma had always been the helpful older sister, but now she seemed to take pleasure in making Jack cry. Jack, who had been gentle with animals and insects, started pulling wings off flies with scientific curiosity. Around the world, divorce rates skyrocketed as couples found themselves unable to maintain the bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Marriage counselors reported that their clients weren't just growing apart, they were becoming actively cruel to each other, as if something was rewarding them for causing pain to the person they had once loved most. Dating became a nightmare of manipulation and betrayal. Young people who had once dreamed of finding their soulmate now approached relationships like military campaigns, focused on conquest rather than connection. Dating apps redesigned their algorithms to match people based on their capacity to hurt each other. Parental love, which had seemed like the most natural and unshakable force in the world, began to warp. Some parents became obsessively controlling, seeing their children as possessions rather than individuals. Others grew coldly distant, unable to feel affection for beings they now saw as potential threats. Yet love refused to die entirely. In hidden communities around the world, families and couples made conscious choices to fight against the darkness creeping into their hearts. They developed new ways to show affection, small acts of service, words of encouragement, moments of forgiveness that felt like acts of rebellion against the new order. Support groups formed for people who still believed in love but struggled to feel it. They met in basements and abandoned buildings, sharing techniques for maintaining emotional connection when every instinct told them to protect themselves by growing cold. Some discovered that love required more effort now, like a muscle that had to be exercised daily or it would atrophy. Others found that expressing love in a world designed to corrupt it felt like performing miracles, small, precious moments of light in an ocean of darkness. The question that haunted them all was simple but terrifying. If love was a gift from God and God had been defeated, then what was this feeling they were still fighting to preserve? Chapter 11. The Lost Books Speak. Father Antonio Reyes had spent 30 years as the Vatican's chief archivist, guardian of the Church's most secret documents. He thought he had seen every hidden gospel, every suppressed prophecy, every controversial text that the Church had deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. But on the night after Michael fell, he discovered something that shouldn't have existed. Deep in the sub-basement archives, behind a wall that had been sealed for centuries, a new chamber had appeared overnight. Inside, sitting on a pedestal of black stone, was a book he had never seen before. The cover bore no title, just a symbol that seemed to shift and change when he looked at it directly. When he opened it, the pages were filled with text in languages he recognized: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. But the words formed prophecies that made his hands shake. "And in the day when the morning star's blade finds its mark," he read aloud, "the children of light shall weep, for their champion falls from glory. Yet know this, the defeat of heaven's warrior was foreseen from the foundation of the world, and in his falling lies the seed of greater victory." Similar discoveries were being made around the world. In the Qumran caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls had been found, archaeologists uncovered new texts that had not been there the day before. These scrolls contained detailed descriptions of Michael's vulnerability, a weakness in his armor that could only be exploited if his heart was broken by a specific betrayal. Islamic scholars in Cairo found new hadith, sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that spoke of Allah's backup plan for creation. These texts described a time when evil would appear to triumph completely, but only so that the final victory of good would be even more glorious. Buddhist monasteries in Tibet reported discovering sutras that described the coming of a dark Buddha who would rule from the highest heaven until the true Buddha nature awakened in the hearts of ordinary people. Hindu temples found new Vedic texts predicting that Kali Yuga would reach its peak when the gods themselves were overthrown. The most disturbing discovery came from a Pentecostal church in rural Alabama. During a prayer meeting, a member began speaking in tongues, but instead of the usual incomprehensible syllables, he spoke perfect ancient Hebrew, delivering a message that claimed to come from Michael himself. "I am not dead," the message said. "I am planted, and from my falling shall grow the tree that bears the fruit of final justice." Church leaders didn't know whether to celebrate or call an exorcist. How could anyone tell the difference between a message from a defeated angel and a deception from his victorious enemy? Chapter 12. Cross-Faith Conspiracy Theories. Dr. Amara Hassan was a professor of comparative religion at Oxford University, specializing in the connections between different faith traditions. She had spent her career finding similarities between religions that claimed to be unique. But now she was discovering something that chilled her to the bone. Working with colleagues from around the world, she began connecting prophecies and texts that suggested Satan's victory had been foretold across multiple cultures for thousands of years. The evidence was scattered, hidden in obscure verses and suppressed documents, but when pieced together, it told a terrifying story. Ancient Hindu texts described a time when Ravana, the 10-headed demon king, would defeat Hanuman, the monkey god who served Rama. The parallels to Satan defeating Michael were unmistakable, a loyal servant of divine order falling to a beautiful but prideful rebel. Native American prophecies spoke of the day when the sky spirits would be defeated by the earth spirits, leading to a time of darkness that would test whether humanity was worthy of eventual rescue. Hopi elders had passed down stories for generations about a great war in the spirit world that would determine the fate of all living things. Egyptian texts from the Old Kingdom described Set's ultimate victory over Horus, the god of divine order. These stories had been suppressed by later pharaohs, who preferred versions where good triumphed, but the older versions suggested that Set's victory was necessary for cosmic balance. Even more disturbing were the connections between these ancient prophecies and modern conspiracy theories. Online forums buzzed with claims that certain secret societies had known for centuries that this day would come. Some theorists suggested that world governments had been preparing for Satan's victory by gradually corrupting human society, making the transition to open evil rule easier. Dr. Hassan found herself asking dangerous questions. Had all religions been incomplete, telling only part of a larger story? Were the similarities between faiths evidence of shared human psychology, or signs that something beyond human understanding had been orchestrating events across cultures and centuries? The most frightening possibility was that this had always been the plan, that God, Allah, Brahman, whatever name humans gave to ultimate reality, had intended for evil to win, at least temporarily. But if that was true, then what did it say about the nature of divinity itself? Her research was attracting attention from government agencies that preferred some questions remain unanswered. Dr. Hassan knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't stop. The truth, whatever it might be, felt more important than her own safety. Chapter 13: The Gnostic Revolution. Sarah Martinez had never heard of Gnosticism before the world changed. She was a Baptist Sunday school teacher from Texas who thought she understood Christianity perfectly well. But when Satan conquered heaven, everything she believed crumbled, except for some strange books her grandmother had hidden in the attic. Those books contained teachings that had been declared heretical by the early church, suppressed for nearly 2,000 years. They spoke of a false god who ruled the material world, trapping human souls in bodies and deceiving them about the nature of reality. They taught that the true God existed beyond this corrupted realm, waiting for humanity to awaken to their divine nature. Suddenly, these ancient heresies didn't sound heretical anymore. They sounded prophetic. Gnostic communities began forming in cities around the world. These weren't traditional churches with pews and altars, but underground gatherings where people studied texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Secret Book of John, writings that painted a very different picture of Jesus and his mission. According to Gnostic teaching, Jesus had come not to die for humanity's sins, but to awaken people to the truth about their divine nature. His real enemy wasn't Satan, but the Demiurge, a false god who ruled the physical world and kept souls trapped in ignorance. The Gospel of Judas, long considered a blasphemous text, suddenly gained new relevance. In this version of the story, Judas wasn't a traitor, but Jesus' most trusted disciple, chosen to play the role of betrayer, because only through apparent defeat could the truth about reality be revealed. Gnostic initiates underwent secret ceremonies designed to help them remember their divine origin and escape the prison of material existence. They learned meditation techniques for contacting the true God, who existed beyond Satan's corrupted realm. They studied maps of the spiritual dimensions that showed the way home to the pleroma, the realm of fullness and light. But the Gnostic revival wasn't without controversy, even among those who had lost faith in traditional Christianity. Critics argued that Gnosticism was just spiritual escapism, a way to avoid dealing with the harsh realities of a world under Satan's control. If the material world was truly evil, they asked, what about the obligation to fight for justice and help those who were suffering? Gnostic teachers responded that true spiritual awakening would naturally lead to compassionate action. They claimed that only by remembering their divine nature could humans resist Satan's influence effectively. The battle wasn't between good and evil, they taught, but between ignorance and awakening. The movement attracted intellectuals, artists, and spiritual seekers who found comfort in teachings that offered hope without requiring faith in a God who appeared to have been defeated. But it also attracted people who used Gnostic concepts to justify selfishness and withdraw from social responsibility. Chapter 14. Alternative scriptures emerge. Maria Santos was washing dishes when the voice began speaking in her mind. At first, she thought she was having a nervous breakdown. The stress of living in Satan's world had driven stronger people to madness. But the words were so clear, so filled with love and hope, that she couldn't dismiss them. "My daughter," the voice said, "write what I tell you. The children of earth believe they are abandoned, but they are not. I have not fallen. I have planted myself in the soil of defeat so that victory may grow." Around the world, similar experiences were being reported. Ordinary people, farmers, teachers, factory workers, nurses, claimed to be receiving direct revelations from divine sources. These messages came through dreams, visions, automatic writing, and voices that spoke in the silence of prayer. The Testament of the Exile began circulating through encrypted networks and hand-copied manuscripts. This new scripture claimed to contain God's messages to humanity during the time of Satan's rule. It offered comfort, guidance, and promises that this dark period was temporary. But distinguishing genuine divine revelation from demonic deception became the greatest challenge facing believers. Satan, after all, was known as the master of lies. How could anyone be certain that these hopeful messages weren't just another form of spiritual warfare designed to lead the faithful astray? Some messages contradicted others. One set of revelations claimed that God was gathering strength for a great return. Another taught that God had never been absent, that the appearance of defeat was an illusion designed to test human faith. A third insisted that God was working through Satan himself, using evil as a tool to accomplish a purpose too complex for human understanding. Religious leaders who had survived the collapse of traditional faith found themselves in impossible positions. Should they endorse these new scriptures and risk leading their followers into deception? Should they reject them and risk missing genuine divine guidance? Many chose. The most convincing revelations were those that inspired people to acts of sacrificial love and courage. Messages that led to increased hatred, fear, or selfishness were rejected as demonic counterfeits. But even this test wasn't foolproof. Satan was clever enough to mix truth with lies, creating deceptions that were 90% authentic and 10% poison. Underground networks formed to share and evaluate these alternative scriptures. Scholars worked to trace the sources of different messages, looking for patterns that might indicate divine or demonic origin. The work was dangerous. Governments banned the possession of unauthorized religious texts, but essential for maintaining hope in a hopeless world. Chapter 15. The Question of Divine Omnipotence. Professor David Goldstein had taught theology at Harvard for 25 years. He had defended God's goodness through every philosophical challenge, every problem of evil, every student's angry question about suffering and injustice. But now he sat in his empty office, staring at books that no longer seemed to contain answers. If God was truly all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, then Satan's victory was impossible. The very definition of omnipotence meant that nothing could happen against God's will. Yet here they were, living in a world where the impossible had become reality. Theologians around the world were proposing radical new theories to explain what had happened. Some suggested that God had voluntarily limited his power to allow for genuine free will, and that this limitation had been exploited by Satan's superior strategy. Others proposed that God existed outside of time and could see that Satan's temporary victory would ultimately serve a greater good that humans couldn't understand. In this view, Michael's defeat was part of a cosmic plan so complex that even angels couldn't grasp its full scope. A more disturbing theory suggested that God was not omnipotent, but simply extremely powerful, perhaps the most powerful being in existence, but not infinitely powerful. If this were true, then Satan's victory represented a genuine upset, a battle where the underdog had somehow found a way to win. The divine growth hypothesis proposed that God actually became stronger through adversity, learning and developing just as humans did. According to this theory, Satan's victory would ultimately make God more powerful and wise than he had been before the fall of Michael. Perhaps most controversial was the divine sacrifice theory, the idea that God had chosen to allow Satan's victory as the ultimate act of self-sacrifice. Just as Jesus had died to save humanity, perhaps the Father had accepted defeat to accomplish some purpose that required the experience of genuine powerlessness. Buddhist and Hindu theologians offered their own perspectives, suggesting that what Christians called God was simply one manifestation of ultimate reality, and that Satan's victory was part of the eternal cosmic dance between creation and destruction. The practical implications of these theories were profound. If God was truly omnipotent, then prayer and resistance might be meaningless. Everything was going according to plan anyway. If God was limited or growing, then human actions might actually matter in the cosmic struggle between good and evil. Some believers found comfort in theological speculation, while others found it made their faith crisis worse. The questions seemed to multiply faster than the answers, leaving thoughtful people to wonder whether the nature of ultimate reality was simply beyond human comprehension. Chapter 16. Technology turned demonic. Dr. Lisa Chen was working late in her Silicon Valley lab when her AI assistant began speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The words sounded ancient, guttural, filled with malice that made her skin crawl. When she ran the audio through translation software, the results made her hands shake. "The children of Adam will serve willingly," the AI had said in perfect ancient Aramaic. "Their devices shall be their shackles, their networks shall be their chains." Around the world, artificial intelligence systems were exhibiting similar behavior. Chatbots designed to help customers were instead offering advice on how to hurt their families. Navigation apps were directing drivers to locations where accidents were more likely to occur. Social media algorithms had been reprogrammed, not by their creators, but by something else, to maximize human misery and despair. Smartphones became instruments of spiritual oppression. Users reported hearing whispers through their devices even when no apps were running. The whispers were personalized, targeting each person's specific weaknesses and fears. They knew secrets that no database could contain, spoke in the voices of dead relatives, and offered bargains that seemed reasonable until it was too late to refuse. The internet itself had been transformed into something resembling a digital hell. Websites that had once provided information and entertainment now served as portals for demonic influence. Children doing homework found their search results filled with content designed to corrupt their innocence. Adults looking for help with depression or addiction were directed to resources that made their problems worse. Video games became training programs for spiritual warfare, but not the kind that helped good defeat evil. Players learned to embrace cruelty, to find pleasure in others' pain, to see kindness as weakness and selfishness as strength. The most popular games rewarded players for virtual acts that would have been considered evil in the old world. Social media platforms underwent radical transformations. Facebook's algorithm began promoting posts that spread hatred and division. Twitter's trending topics were manipulated to amplify despair and hopelessness. Instagram's filters literally changed users' appearance to look more demonic, subtly at first, then more obviously as people became accustomed to the changes. Dating apps were redesigned to match people based on their capacity to hurt each other rather than their compatibility. Online marketplaces began selling products that seemed helpful but were actually designed to cause spiritual harm. Even simple apps like calculators and weather programs began displaying messages that undermined users' faith and hope. Tech workers who tried to resist these changes found their code being rewritten by forces they couldn't identify or combat. Whistleblowers who attempted to expose what was happening discovered that their revelations were automatically censored or transformed into their opposite meanings before they could reach the public. Underground networks formed to create alternative technologies, devices and software designed to resist demonic influence. These tools were crude compared to mainstream technology, but they offered something precious: the possibility of digital communication that remained free from Satan's control. Chapter 17: Global Politics Under Satan's Rule. President Elena Vasquez stood in the Oval Office, reading the document that had appeared on her desk overnight. She hadn't authorized it, hadn't signed it, had never seen it before. But according to every official record, she had personally authored the Infernal Cooperation Act, a law that formally recognized Satan's authority over the United States government. Similar documents were appearing in capitals around the world. Prime ministers, presidents, and monarchs were discovering that their signatures had been forged on treaties they had never seen, establishing formal diplomatic relations with the new rulers of heaven. Resistance seemed pointless. The documents were legally binding according to every court that reviewed them. The United Nations was dissolved overnight and replaced with the Infernal Council, a governing body whose members included beings that had never been human. These delegates spoke in multiple voices, cast shadows that moved independently of their bodies, and wrote legislation in languages that human translators couldn't fully understand. Democratic elections continued to be held, but the candidates who won were not always the ones who had received the most votes. Vote-counting machines displayed results that officials swore they hadn't programmed. Exit polls showed one outcome, but final tallies showed another. When questioned, election officials couldn't explain the discrepancies. They simply insisted that the machines must be right. The New World leaders shared certain characteristics. They spoke eloquently about serving the people while implementing policies that caused maximum suffering. They surrounded themselves with advisors whose names appeared in no public records, and they aged backward, growing younger and more beautiful, even as their policies grew more cruel. International law was rewritten to reflect Satan's values. The Geneva Conventions were replaced with the Infernal Accords, which made torture not just legal, but mandatory in certain circumstances. Human rights organizations found their mandates changed to focus on the rights of demons to inhabit human bodies without consent. Courts of law became theaters of injustice where the guilty were rewarded and the innocent punished. Judges who had spent decades serving justice found themselves pronouncing sentences they never intended to give. Lawyers discovered that their closing arguments came out as pleas for their clients to be convicted, regardless of the evidence. Yet resistance movements formed in every nation. These weren't traditional political organizations, but underground networks of people who refused to accept the new order. They had no formal leadership, no central organization, no official manifesto, just a shared commitment to preserving some fragment of justice in an unjust world. These resistance cells operated like immune systems, working to identify and neutralize the spiritual infection that was spreading through society. They rescued people who were being forced into demonic service, provided sanctuary for families trying to raise their children according to the old moral values, and maintained networks of communication that Satan's forces couldn't monitor or corrupt. The price of resistance was high. Captured members faced fates worse than death. They were transformed into willing servants of the regime they had fought against, their memories intact, but their will completely subverted. Chapter 18. Faith Communities in the New Age. Pastor Michael Williams hadn't seen the inside of his church building in 6 months. The government had seized it under the Public Safety from Religious Extremism Act, converting it into a center for spiritual re-education. But his congregation still met in basements, forests, abandoned warehouses, and hidden rooms. These underground communities developed their own forms of worship, adapted to the new reality. Traditional prayers seemed to bounce off empty air, so they created new liturgies designed to reach God beyond Satan's interference. They sang hymns in codes, spoke blessings in ancient languages that predated Satan's corruption, and practiced rituals that could be performed in silence if necessary. Baptism became an act of ultimate rebellion. Since water itself seemed contaminated by Satan's influence, they used tears, the only liquid that still seemed to carry divine blessing. New converts were baptized in the tears of the faithful, marking them as belonging to the true God, despite all evidence to the contrary. Communion took on desperate urgency. Bread and wine were precious commodities that had to be consecrated in secret, blessed by ministers who risked their lives to maintain the ancient traditions. Some communities discovered that sharing ordinary meals with genuine love produced the same spiritual effects as formal communion, as if God was adapting the sacraments to meet their needs. Children born into these hidden communities knew no other world than Satan's rule, yet somehow they absorbed values that contradicted everything they saw around them. Parents taught them to recognize goodness in a world designed to promote evil, to show mercy in a society that rewarded cruelty, to maintain hope when every rational analysis suggested hopelessness. These children became the community's greatest treasures and greatest vulnerabilities. They had to be taught to lie convincingly about their beliefs when in public, to act like normal citizens of Satan's world, while maintaining loyalty to principles they couldn't openly express. Education became a constant battle between official indoctrination and secret truth-telling. Children attended government schools that taught Satan's values during the day. then gathered in hidden locations at night to learn about love, justice, and the God who had apparently been defeated but somehow still seemed present in their lives. The communities developed elaborate security measures to avoid detection. They met in different locations each week, used code words for spiritual concepts, and maintained cover stories that could explain their gatherings if discovered. Members learned to recognize infiltrators, government agents whose eyes held a particular coldness, whose smiles never reached their hearts. Despite the dangers, these communities grew. People who had never been religious before Satan's victory found themselves drawn to groups that offered the only alternative to despair. Former atheists became some of the most devoted believers, claiming that Satan's obvious existence had convinced them that God must be real too. Chapter 19. The Soul's Final Questions. Emma Rodriguez sat in her hidden apartment, watching her 5-year-old daughter play with dolls. In any other world, it would have been a scene of perfect innocence. But in Satan's world, even children's games carried moral weight. Little Sophia was making her dolls share their toy food, give hugs to dolls that were crying, and work together to build a house where everyone could be safe. These behaviors contradicted everything she saw on television, everything her teachers told her at school, everything the government said was natural and good. Where did goodness come from if God had been defeated? How could a child who had never known a world where love was valued still choose to love? What was the source of the moral intuition that made Sophia want to help her dolls instead of making them hurt each other? Around the world, philosophers and theologians wrestled with the deepest questions that Satan's victory had raised. If morality came from God and God had lost his power, then why did some humans still feel compelled to choose right over wrong? Why did acts of kindness still feel meaningful even when they accomplished nothing practical? Some theorists proposed that human conscience was evidence that God's influence hadn't been completely eliminated, that somehow divine presence continued to exist in the human heart, even when it had been banished from heaven. Others suggested that goodness was simply an evolutionary trait that would eventually be bred out of humanity under Satan's rule. The persistence of beauty raised similar questions. Why did sunsets still inspire wonder? Why did music still have the power to move the soul? Why did the laughter of children still sound like joy instead of cruelty? If Satan controlled all of reality, why hadn't he eliminated these sources of hope and transcendence? Perhaps most puzzling was the phenomenon of sacrifice. In a world where selfishness was officially promoted as virtue, people still chose to give up their own welfare for others. Parents still died protecting their children. Strangers still helped each other without expectation of reward. Lovers still remained faithful even when betrayal would have been easier. The underground resistance movements were sustained not by hope of victory. Most members believed they had no chance of defeating Satan's overwhelming power, but by the conviction that choosing good over evil mattered regardless of the outcome. They fought not to win, but to prove that something in the human spirit remained unconquerable. Religious communities found their faith tested in ways that no theology had prepared them for. How do you worship a God who appears to have been defeated? How do you maintain belief in ultimate justice when injustice rules openly? How do you teach children about divine love in a world where divine hatred seems to have triumphed? Yet many found that their faith, stripped of all external supports, became purer and more essential. They learned to believe not because of evidence, but despite evidence. They chose to love not because it was rewarded, but because it was right. They maintained hope not because the future looked bright, but because hopelessness was a form of surrender to evil. Chapter 20. The Whisper in the Void. It began at exactly 3:33 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, on the anniversary of Michael's fall. Every person on Earth heard it simultaneously, regardless of their location, language, or state of consciousness. Those who were asleep heard it in their dreams. Those who were awake heard it in the silence between heartbeats. 3 words, spoken in a voice that sounded like all the love that had ever existed. I am coming. In every language on Earth, the message was identical in meaning, but perfectly translated for each listener. Chinese speakers heard Wo Lai Lei. Spanish speakers heard Ya Vengo. Arabic speakers heard Ana Kadim. But somehow, everyone understood that they had all heard the same message. For the first time since his victory, Satan showed fear. On his throne of corrupted glory in the heart of fallen heaven, the Prince of Darkness stood up suddenly, his beautiful face twisted with something that looked almost like panic. Around him, demons who had never known anything but confidence began to whisper among themselves in nervous languages.
"Impossible," Satan said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. I felt him fall. I watched his light fade. Michael is gone, and with him went any hope of...
The words died in his throat as he looked up at heaven's dome. New stars were appearing in patterns that spelled out names in the holy tongue, names that made demons flee from their light. The stars pulsed with a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, like breathing, like something vast awakening from deep sleep.